It's the end of the week. It's been a very long week, but you finally weathered through it. And it's finally Friday. Friday night, to be specific. What are you doing? Picture it. Now, for many of us, we might be having a good dinner as a treat. And a good dinner, by definition, might mean good food being paired, good wine, of course, with a loved one or perhaps our friends. For others, we might be at our favorite local pub or local bar, having a few pints, catching up with people over some good banter, enjoying ourselves and just relaxing over the long week. And for some, even more excitingly, we might be at a party, drinking and dancing the night away and just having the time of our lives. And yet for many of us, the next day when we wake up, we feel a sense of regret. We have this headache or perhaps a hangover over the amount of drinks that we had, perhaps even a sense of shame because we're so intoxicated we made a fool of ourselves, perhaps even some regrettable decisions, sometimes even guilt. We could have done something else instead, but we were drinking, and that's a very interesting thing. A lot of us associate a good time to drinking. Yet at the same time, we also have this sense of apprehension towards drinking because society tends to portray drinking as a vice. And naturally, it makes sense, at least from a logical standpoint. Drinking can get you very intoxicated. You can do some rather strange things when you are intoxicated. And of course, we do feel guilty when we drink too much. So much so that people actually abstain from drinking altogether in their lives because they see it as a hindrance towards living a good life. For example, most recently, the American rapper Jack Harlow actually declared that he'll be abstaining from drinking his entire life because he wants to achieve greatness, and that was the barrier towards him achieving it. It's always limited him. And of course, you might have friends around you who are exactly the same. They swear by being entirely sober, no alcohol in their lives, and then perhaps they try and encourage you to do the same thing. And all these sentiments have really got me thinking, is drinking actually bad? And philosophically speaking, should we abstain from drinking altogether? Is it the thing that is stopping us from living a good life? What does philosophy think about it? Now, the philosophical perspective is very interesting. And of course, to delve into it, we must go back to its very starting birthplace, ancient Greece. And the very interesting thing about ancient Greece is that there had always been a very pervasive drinking culture. Now, if you were transported back in time and you were strolling on the ancient streets of Greece, you probably see and meet a lot of very intoxicated characters who are probably making a fool of themselves. Some of them might even be philosophers like Socrates. But again, should we abstain from drinking? You might be surprised that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle would actually say that abstinence is just as unethical and horrible as overindulgence. Now, Aristotle believed that in order for us to live a good life, we must achieve the golden mean. And the golden mean is this principle that recognizes that when you excessively indulge yourself in anything, that is disastrous. At the same time, it also recognizes that when you practice absolute deficiency and rob yourself of that experience in your life, it could also lead to a very bad life. The key is actually to achieve a balance. To not overindulge, but also not to abstain entirely, but to live moderately. And applying the golden mean principle, according to Aristotle, is what would lead to a very good life, a life that is worth living. But the key to applying the golden mean to anything must start with the activity in question. And according to Aristotle, we must examine the virtue of every single thing that we do. In other words, the reason of doing that certain thing. You must ask yourself this question. So from his perspective, when we drink, we should question ourselves why we drink. So according to his philosophical perspective, if we were to incorporate drinking into our good lives, we must ask ourselves why we drink. Is it for a sense of escapism? Is it for a sense of emotional regulation? Is it for a sense of enhanced experiences, enhanced consciousness? Or is it a sense of social connection? Or does it give us courage or inspiration or creativity to do the things I want to do in our lives? There must be a reason and a good reason. That is how you determine whether the activity itself is worth doing. And once you've discovered that virtuous activity for you, that's when you should apply the golden mean principle. By all means, partake in that activity, but don't lose yourself in it, because overindulgence can lead you to lose your own character and your own sense of self. And of course, we can think about addiction and truly very alcoholic people who have lost themselves. At the same time, don't rob yourself of the experience. Never live a life where you've not experienced everything you want to experience. And never live a life of fear, seclusion, and reclusion. And that is really Aristotle's perspective. So from this perspective, if you have a good enough reason reason for why you drink, and that reason should only apply to you. Drinking in moderation is fine. Yet despite the fact that this might seem like a very optimistic view, why has there been so much apprehension towards drinking? Well, that's because the early ethicists and the early ethical views of drinking revolve around the question of rationality. You see, we humans are defined by our ability to reason. That's what separates us from animals. Animals act on instinct. We, on the other hand, we are able to reason, able to think. But when you get intoxicated, when you get into the state of drunkenness, you lose that ability to reason. Oftentimes, people behave very unreasonably. And because it's robbing you of your rationality, early ethicists viewed it as being potentially something that would rob you of your own moral character. And indeed, the views of early ethicists really formulated itself into governance too. We've seen, for example, in the Americas, the Prohibition period, where alcohol was largely banned, and regulation throughout history has always been very adversarial towards drinking altogether. So from that perspective, you might be wondering, does that mean that we shouldn't drink then? Does that mean that the activity is not virtuous? Well, not entirely so. Because if we are to adopt the view of the ethicists that drinking robs us of our rationality, then we must also realize that drinking is never really so black and white, is it? Not all people that we meet who drink suddenly become animals. There are, of course, people who drink responsibly. People who might drink and yet are still themselves. Sure, they might be slightly different, at least in the sense of the Dutch courage they might have, but certainly they are nowhere as irrational as the early ethicists might fear. And this is indeed why, if you look at governance, regulation towards drinking has actually laxed throughout history, from a period of being the strict absolution towards the current state, where very much relaxed in most countries around the world. Because as much as we're fearful that alcohol might turn us into these wild animals, it doesn't always. Again, it comes down to the question of moderation. But if we were to adopt the views of the ethicists, you shouldn't drink if it actually impairs your rationality to such a substantial degree. In other words, if you're the sort of person that likes to get absolutely hammered and drunk, and you no longer recognize yourself, then at least from this ethical standpoint, you shouldn't drink. But talking about ethics and rationality, it is very interesting because modern day philosophers, especially psychologists, actually take a totally different view. Rather than see the impairment of rationality as a reason of why we shouldn't drink, they see it as a reason why we should drink. If you were to look into the work of Dr. Abraham Maslow, his research actually shows that intoxication is able to help us achieve peak experiences. Now, peak experiences is very hard to define, and I don't want to butcher Dr. Maslow's work. But essentially, when you are sober, you behave in your own ways, certainly. But there might be a sense of rigidity to that. Your conscious mind might actually hold you back from truly experiencing life in a full way. And actually intoxicating yourself, according to Dr. Maslow, allows you to remove those barriers and actually experience life much more fully, to achieve the peak of the experiences of life. For example, you might be a person who's very socially conscious, and that has always been a hindrance towards you connecting with certain people. But when you're intoxicated, you might lose that rigidity and actually open yourself up to other people. And indeed, not just people, perhaps even certain experiences. Perhaps intoxication can also be a source of inspiration and creativity for your life. And his sentiments is widely shared by other psychologists and researchers in this area. For example, the work of William James, where he actually experienced directly on himself and also participants subjecting themselves to intoxication and documenting it. And he's fully convinced that intoxication can bring people a great sense of transcendence that is almost religious in nature, can bring us this great sense of happiness, unity, peace, fulfillment, excitement when done right. According to William, it is important to approach it as such and being conscious of actually subjecting yourself to intoxication with these things in mind. So what does this all mean? You might be thinking, Melvin, are you suggesting that we should all just become alcoholics and just drink as a path to good life? Certainly not. Tying everything together, we have to realize that we mustn't overindulge in drinking. That is a path that is perilous, and we might lose ourselves. We must begin by asking ourselves, what is our reason for drinking? And within the right context, we can drink in moderation. It would be much better than depriving yourself. Certainly not towards a point where we lose our rationality entirely and we just become these really wild and reckless and irresponsible animals, but also realizing the benefit of actually drinking. how it could actually allow us to experience much more enhanced experiences in life than we would otherwise, and at the same time being conscious of us doing it, seeing how we fit drinking as an activity into our overall lives. And if you're unable to do that, if you're a person that has self-control issues, or perhaps you have become addicted to drinking as the only means to experience anything in life, and you're just overindulging in it, and perhaps abstaining from it is the only way to go. But otherwise, if done right, just like anything in life, it could actually be an avenue to greater experiences. And perhaps that's why philosophy has never really introduced an absolute no to drinking. So next time when you have a sip of your favorite wine, favorite cocktail, ask yourself, what does that drink mean to you? And are you practicing the golden mean?